In the quiet and often dimly lit world of medieval villages and towns, the figure of the healer occupied a peculiar and difficult place. The work of the healer was necessary, but it was also fraught with challenges, doubts, and daily burdens that made the life of such a person heavy in ways that are easy to overlook when thinking of the distant past. A medieval healer was not a doctor in the modern sense, with organized training and dependable tools. Rather, the healer was someone who existed on the fragile edge between folk wisdom, traditional remedies, and the expectations of communities that wanted solutions to their suffering, yet often distrusted the very person providing them. The pace of life was slow, and time seemed to stretch in endless cycles of planting, harvesting, fasting, and feasting. And yet, for the healer, every day could bring unexpected visits from neighbors seeking help with illnesses, injuries, or mysterious ailments that no one understood clearly. The healer would wake in the early hours of the morning, often in a small and simple dwelling made from wood or stone, with a roof that sometimes leaked in a rain, and a hearth that needed to be carefully tended to keep in the warmth. The healer's possessions were few. A wooden chest might hold dried herbs tied together in small bundles, perhaps a small knife with a worn handle, a bowl or mortar for grinding, and a handful of manuscripts or scraps of parchment if the healer was unusually fortunate or connected to a monastery. Most healers, however, relied not on books, but on memory, on practice, and on stories passed down from elders. The smell of herbs, both sharp and earthy, would linger in the space, mixed with the smoke of the fire and the faint scent of dampness that clung to medieval homes. In this environment, the healer would begin the day not with certainty, but with preparation for whatever the day might bring. There were no schedules in the modern sense, no clinics with waiting rooms or appointment books. Instead, the healer might step outside to gather plants from the hedgerows or the edges of fields. Early morning was often the preferred time, when the dew was still clinging to leaves and the plants were fresh and supple. Collecting herbs required patience and attention. Some were for soothing stomach aches, others for treating wounds, and still others were thought to protect against fevers or evil spirits. The healer might pause at a patch of nettles, at sprigs of sage, at clusters of yarrow, bending low and murmuring a prayer while cutting small portions to take home. It was a simple but time-consuming process, and often thankless because villagers rarely considered how much effort went into keeping these plants at hand. When someone came to the healer's door, the problem might be something as mundane as a persistent cough or as alarming as a festering wound from an accident in the fields. The healer would look closely, though their understanding of what caused such ailments was shaped by the limited knowledge of the time. Illness was often thought to be a matter of imbalances in the body, corrupt humors, or the influence of bad air and unseen forces. A healer might apply a poultice of herbs, wrap a bandage made from scraps of cloth, or recommend a mixture of wine, honey, and plants boiled into a bitter drink. Sometimes the advice involved rest and prayer, or charms whispered quietly to give comfort to the anxious. Yet, despite these efforts, results were far from guaranteed. The healer might watch as a patient grew worse, the infection spreading, the fever rising, the breathing becoming ragged. Families would look at the healer with a mix of hope and suspicion, their eyes searching for signs of failure or success. If the patient recovered, The healer might be praised for their skill or blessed as a servant of divine will. But if the patient died, blame could easily shift, and whispers might begin that the healer was unskilled, or even that they were meddling with powers they should not touch. It was this uncertain reputation, swinging between gratitude and mistrust, that made the healer's role a difficult one to endure. Daily life carried its own burdens as well. The healer was rarely wealthy, for people often paid not with coins, but with whatever they could spare: a loaf of bread, a few eggs, some vegetables, or the promise of help with harvesting in the coming season. The healer lived close to the edge of poverty, never far from hunger, and their ability to survive depended not only on their skills, but on the goodwill of their neighbors. A healer could not refuse to help, for that would invite resentment, yet helping did not always bring reliable support. To live in this way was to walk a narrow path, giving constantly, but receiving unevenly, always balancing between survival and service. There was also the matter of the church, which loomed large over all aspects of medieval life. Officially, healing was the work of God, and prayer, confession, and holy relics were considered powerful remedies for illness. Healers who relied on herbs and charms had to tread carefully, for their work could easily be seen as suspicious or even heretical. Some healers tried to align themselves with the church, learning Latin prayers, invoking saints, or keeping a crucifix nearby. Others worked quietly, avoiding too much attention, staying humble and inconspicuous. A healer who attracted too much notice risked accusations of witchcraft or sorcery, especially if their treatments seemed unusual or if they were successful in ways that frightened those around. In the evenings, after the visits and tasks of the day, the healer might sit by the fire and sort through the bundles of plants collected earlier. There would be roots to clean and dry, leaves to press, flowers to store carefully in clay jars or simple cloth pouches. The healer's hands were often stained with the green of herbs, the brown of earth, and the faint traces of blood from tending to wounds. They worked slowly, methodically, knowing that each bundle might be needed urgently at some unexpected moment. The rhythm of this work was steady, repetitive, almost meditative, yet it carried the weight of responsibility. The healer's mind was rarely at rest. Thoughts of the sick child seen earlier in the day might linger. The image of a wound that did not seem to heal might come back again and again. The healer knew that they could do only so much, and that much of what happened lay beyond their control, yet the burden of being asked to help made it difficult to let go. This quiet heaviness, carried silently, was another reason why the role of healer was so difficult to bear. And then there was the physical environment itself. Medieval life was marked by cold winters and damp springs, by muddy roads and smoky hearths. The healer often had to walk long distances to reach patients, trudging through fields and forests, carrying their modest supplies in a satchel or basket. The journey could be tiring, and by the time they arrived, the patient might already be near the end, leaving the healer with little to offer but presence and ritual comfort. The journey back would be even slower, the healer walking alone under the dim light of the moon or the flickering glow of a lantern, the air heavy with mist or the smell of wet earth. The healer lived within a world of limitations, of constant labor, of fragile respect, and of unending demands. And though many healers accepted this as their place in the community, it was not an easy life.
The work was steady and repetitive, filled with quiet tasks and uncertain outcomes, and always shadowed by the possibility of blame.
In this way, to be a healer in the medieval world was to live a life both necessary and burdened, respected and distrusted, sustained and yet precarious. The life of the healer unfolded in a rhythm that was both familiar and unpredictable, shaped by the steady cycles of the seasons, and yet interrupted at any moment by sudden calls for help. As spring turned to summer, the fields around the village grew tall with grain, the air buzzing with insects, and the days stretching long and warm. For the healer, this meant not only more time to gather and dry herbs, but also more injuries from farm work, more fevers brought by stagnant water, and more children coughing in the smoky air of cottages. The work did not pause for the changing seasons, it only shifted in character, presenting new challenges that required patience and endurance. In the bright mornings of summer, the healer might rise early and walk along the hedgerows to look for plants that were best harvested at a certain stage of their growth. The light would fall gently on the leaves, and the air would carry the mingled scents of soil, grass, and blossoms. Each plant had its time, and the healer needed to remember not only what to gather, but also when. Some herbs lost their strength if taken too late, while others were considered most potent if picked just before flowering. The healer would bend low, hands brushing over stems and roots, occasionally pausing to cut carefully with a small knife or to pull gently from the earth. These tasks were unhurried and repetitive, almost soothing in their simplicity, though they demanded steady attention and long hours. At home, the healer would hang bundles from the rafters or spread leaves on wooden boards near the fire, letting them dry slowly. The process filled the dwelling with fragrance, sometimes sharp, sometimes sweet, sometimes earthy and bitter. The space would become a storehouse of scents, each carrying a different memory of fields, woods, or gardens. It was a kind of invisible library, built not of parchment, but of smells and textures, each herb a word in the healer's quiet language of remedies. But while this gathering and preparing might seem calm, the healer was never free from interruptions. A knock on the door, hurried footsteps outside, or the anxious face of a neighbor could arrive at any moment, asking for help with a sudden fever or a wound that would not stop bleeding. The healer would set aside the drying herbs, pick up a small basket of supplies, and walk quickly to the patient's home. There, in the dim light of a smoky cottage, with chickens scratching in the dirt floor and children whispering nearby, the healer would kneel beside the sickbed. The tools were simple: a cloth soaked in vinegar, a poultice of mashed herbs, a small wooden cup filled with a bitter drink. There was no certainty, only hope that the remedy might ease the pain, or at least give comfort to the family. The healer's reputation was built not only on skill, but also on demeanor. Calmness was expected, even when the situation was grave. Villagers looked for steady hands and quiet words, and the healer had to provide them, even when doubts filled the mind. It was not easy to remain composed when watching a child struggle to breathe or when seeing a wound that seemed beyond help. But showing fear or uncertainty could weaken the trust of those who asked for aid. So the healer learned to speak slowly, to move carefully, and to give the impression of control even when the outcome was beyond human power. Payment for such services was uneven and uncertain. Sometimes a grateful family might offer a portion of meat from a slaughtered animal, or a basket of apples picked fresh from an orchard, or a piece of cloth carefully woven during the long winter months. At other times, nothing was offered beyond thanks or a promise of repayment at some later date. The healer rarely asked for more, knowing that to press too hard would cause resentment. Instead, survival depended on quiet acceptance, on making do with whatever came, and on stretching resources as far as possible. Hunger was a familiar companion, and the healer's household often lived with less than those who worked the fields, for the healer's labor did not yield grain or livestock, but rather uncertain gratitude and fragile trust. The tension with the church was always present, even if unspoken. Priests reminded their congregations that true healing came from God, that sickness was often a test of faith or a punishment for sin. Pilgrimages to shrines, prayers before relics, and confessions of wrongdoing were considered the proper cures for illness. The healer, working with plants and charms, occupied a space that was both tolerated and mistrusted. Many healers tried to blend their remedies with prayers, sprinkling holy water over a poultice or invoking the name of a saint while applying an ointment. In this way, they sought to show that their work was not opposed to the church, but aligned with it. Still, suspicion lingered, and it was easy for villagers to whisper that a healer's unusual success was the work of forbidden forces. Accusations did not always come, but the fear of them was enough to shape the healer's behavior. Modesty, humility, and discretion were essential. To boast of skill was dangerous, for it invited envy and scrutiny. Better to remain quiet, to let results speak gently, and to accept both praise and criticism with the same calm expression. The healer's survival depended not only on knowledge of herbs, but also on the delicate art of navigating the shifting moods of the community. In the quieter hours, when no one knocked and no one called, the healer might sit outside, watching the slow movements of the clouds, the swaying of trees in the wind, the lazy circling of birds. These moments of rest were few, but they allowed the healer to breathe and to gather strength for the next demand. Even in rest, though, the mind would wander to the work. Was enough yarrow stored for the coming autumn? Were the jars of dried sage still well sealed? Would there be enough supplies to last through winter when fresh plants would not be available? These thoughts turned slowly in the healer's mind, repeating in quiet cycles, never fully leaving, always reminding of the responsibility that could not be set aside. Winter, when it came, brought new difficulties. The cold crept into every home, the air thick with smoke from poorly vented fires. Coughs spread quickly, fevers rose in damp cottages, and accidents in icy fields brought cuts and bruises that healed slowly in the chill. The healer's supplies dwindled, jars and bundles growing emptier with each passing week. Trips outside to gather fresh plants were impossible, the earth hard and frozen, the hedgerows bare. What remained had to be stretched carefully, used sparingly, and sometimes replaced with whatever substitutes could be found. The healer's hands grew stiff in the cold, and yet the calls for help did not stop.
Neighbors knocked more often, desperate for relief, bringing their sick children wrapped in thin blankets, their weary faces limed with worry. And those months, the healer's work was perhaps at its hardest. There was little light, little warmth, little certainty. Remedies that might have helped in summer seemed weaker in winter, when bodies were already tired and undernourished. The healer could do little more than provide what comfort was possible, offering warm drinks, soothing compresses, and quiet presence by the fireside. And yet, even when remedies failed, people still came, for the healer's presence itself gave a kind of reassurance. To be seen, to be touched, to hear quiet words spoken in the midst of suffering, these were forms of healing, even if the sickness continued. The healer carried this role as well, not only treating bodies, but also carrying the weight of fear and sorrow that surrounded illness. To be a healer was therefore not only to work with herbs and wounds, but also to live in constant negotiation with need, with expectation, and with limitation. It was a life without rest from responsibility, without certainty of survival, and without protection from suspicion. And yet, it was also a life bound deeply to the rhythms of nature and to the fabric of the community, a life of endless small tasks that filled the days with steady labor.
As the years passed for a healer in the medieval world, the patterns of life repeated themselves with a slow familiarity, though no 2 days were ever quite the same. Each season returned with its particular challenges, each year brought new faces to the village, and each illness reminded the healer of the fragility of life. The healer's work was steady, unending, and always accompanied by a quiet awareness that their role was as much a burden as it was a service. The healer's knowledge was never fixed in place. It grew slowly, shaped by experience and by memory, not by formal training or study. Every time a wound was treated, the healer noted in their mind whether the poultice seemed to draw out the infection or whether the patient's pain lessened after certain herbs were given. If a fever broke after a particular mixture of sage and honey, that detail was remembered and added to the healer's inner store of wisdom. Yet, just as often, remedies seemed to fail, and the healer had to endure the heavy silence of a grieving family. From such failures, too, lessons were learned, though the lesson was often only that there were limits to what could be done. This slow accumulation of experience was the healer's only library, and it was carried not on parchment, but in the quiet recesses of the mind. Occasionally, a healer might meet others of their kind, traveling through villages or stopping at fairs. Such encounters were rare but valuable, for they offered a chance to exchange knowledge, to share small secrets about plants, and to learn of remedies used in distant places. These conversations were often cautious, for each healer guarded their knowledge carefully, knowing that it was the source of their livelihood. Still, there was comfort in discovering that others struggled with the same doubts, the same failures, the same suspicions from their communities. The knowledge that one was not alone in this strange profession gave a quiet strength, even if it was rarely spoken of aloud. The healer's relationship with patients was shaped not only by need, but by familiarity. In a small community, everyone knew everyone, and so the healer was called not only to treat strangers, but to tend to neighbors, friends, and sometimes family. This made the work heavier, for it was harder to remain calm when the sick child was one the healer had seen grow from infancy, or when the suffering elder had shared stories by the fire many winters before. In these moments, the healer had to balance personal feelings with the steady, practiced motions of the work. There was no room to show fear or sorrow, even when the heart was heavy. The healer's hands continued their tasks, grinding herbs, tying bandages, whispering prayers, even as the mind struggled with grief. At times, the healer was asked to attend births. This was both an honor and a danger, for childbirth was a moment of great hope, but also of great risk. The healer would sit close by the mother, offering warm water, soft cloths, and mixtures of herbs meant to ease pain or strengthen the body. Hours would pass slowly, filled with quiet encouragement, with murmured prayers, with the steady rhythm of breathing. Sometimes the outcome was joyful, the cry of a newborn filling the room, the mother weary but alive. Other times, the silence that followed was heavy, and the healer's role became one of comfort rather than cure. In such moments, blame could fall swiftly, for families struggling with loss often looked for someone to hold responsible. The healer, being present, was an easy target, and so even when everything possible had been done, accusations might linger in whispered tones. Superstition clung to the healer's work in ways that could never be fully avoided. Many villagers believed that illnesses were not caused by natural causes alone, but by curses, spirits, or the evil eye. The healer was expected not only to treat the body, but also to ward off these unseen threats. Charms might be hung above a doorway, words muttered over a bowl of water, or small objects buried at the edge of a field. Whether or not these actions had any effect was less important than the comfort they provided, for belief itself carried power in the minds of those who suffered. The healer knew this, and so such rituals were performed patiently, without protest, as much a part of the work as mixing herbs or binding wounds. The healer's dwelling reflected the modesty of their life. It was never grand, never adorned with luxuries. A single room, or perhaps two, with a hearth at the center, a rough table, and a narrow bed. Herbs hung in bunches from beams overhead, jars lined simple shelves, and tools rested in small baskets. The smell of smoke, of dried plants, of damp wood, and of soil filled the space. Visitors entering the home often wrinkled their noses, for the mixture of scents was strong, though for the healer it was the natural perfume of daily labor. The home was not a place of rest in the modern sense, for work continued there at all hours, with remedies to be prepared, bandages to be washed, and herbs to be sorted. Food was simple and often scarce.
a pot of thin soup simmering on the hearth, bread baked with coarse flour, a few vegetables from the garden, perhaps a piece of cheese if it could be spared. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions, or offered as payment by grateful patients. The healer's own health was often fragile, worn down by long hours, poor diet, and constant exposure to illness. Yet there was little choice but to continue, for others depended on their presence. To fall sick oneself was to risk both livelihood and reputation, and so the healer tried to keep strength by resting when possible, and by drinking the same teas and broths they offered to others. Travel was another part of the healer's burden. Villages were small and scattered, and patients might live far from the healer's home. A walk of an hour or two was not unusual, along muddy tracks, through forests, across fields, in all kinds of weather. Carrying supplies in a satchel, the healer would trudge onward, boots damp, cloak heavy with rain, breath misting in the cold air. By the time the healer arrived, tired and chilled, the work was only just beginning. There was no thought of refusing, for to turn away from a sick neighbor would destroy the fragile trust on which the healer's survival depended. So the healer walked and walked again, repeating the journey countless times over the years, the roads and paths becoming as familiar as the lines of the hands. The healer's existence was therefore one of constant giving, constant presence, and constant caution. Gratitude was given sometimes, resentment at other times, but rarely security or rest. And yet, despite the hardships, the healer continued, for the role was both chosen and imposed, shaped by skill, by necessity, and by the needs of the community. It was a life marked by small acts repeated endlessly, by routines that stretched across seasons, and by the quiet endurance of burdens that could not be set aside. When autumn returned each year, it brought with it a mixture of preparation and unease for the healer. The fields filled with the sight of harvest, the air grew cooler, and the evenings lengthened. For villagers, this was a time of gathering food and storing it away, of celebrating the completion of labor, and of preparing for the long, dark months to come. For the healer, however, it was also the season of stocking herbs and remedies, of carefully checking supplies, and of worrying whether enough had been stored to last until spring. The healer's hands moved steadily through this work, sorting bundles of dried plants, tying them with string, placing them in clay jars or cloth bags. Each herb carried not only its own fragrance, but also its own sense of importance. Sage leaves crisped and brittle from summer sun, yarrow stalks gathered from meadows,
dried chamomile flowers still faintly sweet, nettle leaves dark and rough, and roots dug from damp earth in late summer. All of these were gathered and stored, each with its place in the healer's quiet order. The shelves in the small home became crowded with these modest treasures, and yet the healer knew that they could vanish quickly once winter illnesses set in. There was always a certain worry that something essential might have been overlooked. Perhaps too little of a plant had been collected, or perhaps a jar would spoil if not sealed properly, or perhaps a needed root had been missed in its season and would not be available until the cycle of the year came around again. These quiet fears pressed upon the healer's mind, turning the work of preparation into an unending calculation, a constant balancing of what was on hand against what might be needed. During this time, villagers often sought remedies for the small but persistent ailments of autumn: aches from long hours of harvesting, stomach pains from eating food too quickly in celebration, colds caught from working in damp weather. The healer's door was rarely without a visitor, and each visit brought another small portion of the stored herbs being measured, mixed, or boiled. Payment, if it came, was in the form of apples from the orchard, a jug of ale brewed after harvest, or a small piece of cloth. These offerings were appreciated, yet they did little to ease the healer's worry about the cold months ahead. The healer's life was filled with such small exchanges, never grand, never certain, always humble. A day might pass in tending to nothing more than scratches and coughs, and yet it left the healer weary, for each request carried weight. The villagers looked to the healer not only for remedies, but also for reassurance. The act of being present, of touching a hand, of speaking slowly, was as important as the herbs themselves. The healer's calm presence was considered part of the cure, and so the healer carried the responsibility of maintaining that calmness, even when tired or hungry. The long evenings of autumn brought quiet hours by the fire, when the healer might sit and mend clothing, stir a pot of broth, or slowly grind dried herbs into powder. The light of the flames flickered over the walls, and shadows danced across the bundles of plants hanging above. The sounds of the village drifted in, the bark of a dog, the distant call of voices, the creak of carts returning from fields. In these moments, the healer's life seemed steady and almost peaceful, though beneath it ran the constant current of responsibility. There was no rest, only pauses between tasks, only short stretches of stillness before the next call came. When winter arrived, it brought with it the familiar heaviness. The cold pressed into every corner, fires burned low, and food supplies dwindled. The healer's visits multiplied, for illness spread quickly in cramped and smoky cottages. Children grew pale with fever, elders weakened under the weight of coughs, and accidents from icy roads and slippery paths brought fresh injuries. The healer moved from home to home, sat at bedsides, and worked with dwindling supplies, always aware that each remedy used left one fewer for the weeks to come. The strain of such a season was visible in the healer's face, in the tired eyes, in the slow steps. And yet, there was no choice but to continue. To refuse would mean breaking trust, and to break trust was to invite isolation, suspicion, and possible ruin. So the healer worked on, quietly, patiently, carefully, each act another small offering to the community, each act another piece of the endless labor of survival. There was also the matter of knowledge passed down in whispers. Older healers sometimes shared small pieces of advice before they died, secrets spoken in hushed tones, fragments of experience preserved in memory. The younger healers listened closely, storing these fragments as carefully as they stored herbs, knowing that such words could not be found in books. In this way, the healer's craft was kept alive, not through grand teachings, but through quiet conversations, through repetition, through the unbroken chain of experience carried across generations. The healer's life was also bound to the rhythm of prayer. Whether truly devout or simply cautious, many healers included blessings and invocations in their work. A prayer whispered while grinding herbs, a cross traced in the air above a wound, a saint's name spoken quietly while pouring out a drink. All of these actions linked the work of the healer to the spiritual world that shaped medieval life. Such gestures reassured patients and protected the healer from suspicion, showing that their labor was aligned with faith rather than opposed to it. In truth, the healer walked a narrow path between worlds, the world of practical remedies drawn from earth and plants, and the world of belief, where unseen forces were thought to cause sickness and health alike. To survive, the healer had to move carefully in both worlds, never leaning too far toward one or the other, always maintaining balance, always presenting a face of calm humility. And so the days turned, and so the years passed, with the healer moving steadily through the cycles of seasons, always working, always preparing, always carrying the burdens of others while living on the edge of uncertainty. It was not a life of glory or of wealth. It was not a life of rest. It was a life of quiet endurance, where every task repeated, every season returned, and every step carried the weight of responsibility. The healer's burden in the medieval world was never a matter of grand gestures or sudden victories against disease, but rather a long and wearying journey of constant attention to the small troubles of daily existence, which accumulated into something much larger than one might expect when considering the endless cycle of human frailty and the environment in which people lived. To continue examining the life of such a figure, one must look closely at the way they encountered not only the dramatic and frightening illnesses, but also the ordinary ailments, the coughs, the toothaches, the stomach cramps, the itchy rashes, and the lingering fevers that were never so severe as to inspire fear of death, yet were ever-present companions in the lives of villagers. Each complaint, however minor,
was brought to the healer, and each complaint required some attempt at treatment, some gesture that might offer comfort or at least the appearance of care. This created a routine in which every day was filled with small requests, repeated visits, and the expectation of endless patience. A toothache in the medieval world could last for weeks or months, and there was little a healer could do except suggest rinses with warm wine, chewing on certain herbs, or even, in more extreme cases, attempting extraction with crude tools that often caused more pain than relief. Still, the healer was expected to endure the cries of those who could not sleep at night, who sat up by the fire, pressing their jaws, hoping for mercy. Likewise, stomach troubles caused by spoiled food or unclean water were so common that a healer's table might be filled with bowls of dried peppermint, fennel seeds, and other plants thought to ease digestion. People would drink simple infusions, wait for some effect, and return days later with the same complaint. These constant cycles of treatment and disappointment wore down the spirit of the healer, yet the healer carried on, repeating the same rituals, speaking in the same calm tone, creating the impression that each patient was receiving something valuable, when in truth the outcome rarely changed. The healer's home itself often reflected the burden of this endless cycle. Shelves might sag under the weight of small jars filled with dried roots, powders, and leaves, each carefully labeled in a simple manner, perhaps only with a scratched mark or a strip of parchment tied to the container. The air smelled faintly of dried plants, mixed with smoke from the hearth, and sometimes the sharp odor of vinegar or wine used for preserving. On a table, there might be bundles of herbs tied with string, some fresh from the fields, others brittle from long storage. Patients would sit nearby on a rough stool or low bench, waiting for the healer to prepare a concoction, sipping hot infusions slowly while explaining their pains in long and winding detail. The healer learned to listen patiently, nodding, repeating soft words, and offering the same herbs again and again, because there were few alternatives to provide. In many villages, the healer was also drawn into matters of childbirth, a responsibility that could not be refused, though it carried immense risks. To attend a laboring woman was to accept the possibility of loss, either of the child or of the mother, or sometimes both, and yet the healer was expected to remain calm, steady, and reassuring. The work was long, often lasting through the night, with the healer seated by the bedside, encouraging the mother, rubbing her back, and whispering prayers or charms while preparing warm cloths and herbal mixtures. Sometimes the birth went smoothly, and cries of relief filled the small home. At other times, hours turned into days, and the healer could only watch helplessly as exhaustion overtook both mother and midwives. Tools were few, knowledge was limited, and outcomes were uncertain. Yet still the healer was called upon for each new birth, carrying the memory of failures silently, never daring to speak them aloud, for such confessions might weaken the fragile trust the community placed in them.
Even beyond the tasks of healing bodies, the medieval healer was frequently drawn into matters of the spirit. Many people believed that illness came from curses, bad air, or displaced spirits, and so the healer was asked to perform small rituals, to recite prayers, or to provide protective charms made from herbs, stones, or carved pieces of wood. These actions were often repeated mechanically, with little belief on the part of the healer, yet the performance itself was important, for it reassured the patient and their family that something was being done. The healer might walk around a sick person's bed, sprinkling water, muttering a sequence of words, and tying a bundle of herbs above the doorway to prevent evil from entering. These gestures brought calm, and calmness was often the only true medicine available. But while such rituals offered comfort, they also exposed the healer to suspicion and danger. If an illness did not improve, or if a child died despite their efforts, whispers might spread that the healer's powers were false, or worse, that the healer had brought harm instead of help. In a world where suspicion was common, and where misfortune was often blamed on unseen forces, the healer lived precariously between respect and mistrust. A neighbor might call them wise one day and a dangerous figure the next, depending entirely on outcomes beyond their control. The healer knew this instability well, and so they lived carefully, avoiding bold claims, speaking in modest tones, and always deflecting responsibility when asked for guarantees. The healer's work also included an endless attention to the seasons, for the timing of plant gathering was as important as the plants themselves. In spring, they walked the fields and hedges, cutting young shoots, roots, and blossoms, carrying them home in woven baskets. In summer, they dried bundles of herbs in the sun, tying them under the eaves of their homes or hanging them from beams where smoke from the hearth would keep them free from rot. In autumn, they dug roots, heavy and damp with soil, washing them carefully before slicing and laying them out to dry. In winter, they relied on what had been preserved, rationing supplies carefully so that nothing essential ran out before the growing season returned. Each year was a repetition of the last, and each year brought new challenges when crops failed or when rains spoiled the drying process. The healer lived with constant worry over whether enough herbs had been gathered, whether enough had been stored, and whether the small jars lining the shelves would be sufficient for the needs of the long winter ahead. The rhythm of such a life was steady but heavy. Each day began early, often before the sun had risen, with the simple tasks of preparing the hearth, boiling water, and setting out herbs for the day. Patients arrived without warning, sometimes in the quiet of dawn, sometimes long after night had fallen, for illness respected no schedule. The healer learned to expect interruptions, to eat meals quickly, to sleep lightly, always ready to rise and attend to a knock at the door. Their own rest was often broken,
their own health worn down by fatigue, yet there was no choice but to continue, for the community relied upon them. To refuse service was to risk alienation, and to disappoint too often was to invite suspicion. Over time, the healer's life became defined not by moments of triumph, but by the slow accumulation of burdens, each small and ordinary, yet together overwhelming. And still, through it all, the healer endured, repeating the same practices, maintaining the same calm exterior, performing the same rituals, and offering the same herbs again and again, because in a world with so few answers, the appearance of care was often the most important gift they could provide.
The later stages of a healer's life in the medieval world often carried with them a quiet heaviness, a weariness that grew not from any single event, but from the repetition of decades of small tasks, endless complaints, uncertain remedies, and fragile trust. By the time a healer reached old age, they had tended to hundreds of patients, perhaps thousands, if one counted every cough soothed, every wound cleaned, every fever watched through long nights. Yet despite this lifetime of service, they rarely possessed the security or the peace that one might imagine was due to them. Instead, they continued to live in small dwellings with shelves crowded by jars and baskets, still called upon at every hour, still carrying the weight of expectation that never seemed to lessen with time. The body of the healer, too, grew tired. Their hands, once steady enough to mix powders or stitch wounds, became slower, their eyes less sharp, their back bent from years of bending over bedsides and gathering herbs in the fields. Climbing the hills to collect plants became more difficult, and often younger helpers, sometimes apprentices, sometimes simply relatives or neighbors, were asked to perform the more strenuous tasks. Yet the healer could never fully withdraw, for their knowledge was seen as irreplaceable. The community might insist that they continue, even when fatigue and pain pressed them to stop. Thus the healer often carried on long after they wished to rest, moving more slowly, sitting more often, but still responding when their name was called. What made this situation particularly heavy was that, unlike in other trades, there was little to leave behind at the end of a healer's life. A blacksmith might pass down a forge and tools, a weaver might leave behind a loom, a farmer might leave fields and livestock. The healer, however, passed down knowledge that was fragile and uncertain, often incomplete and sometimes mistrusted. An apprentice might learn a handful of recipes, might memorize the preparation of a few important herbs, and might inherit a shelf of dried bundles and clay jars, but there was no guarantee that the community would extend to them the same trust it had given to the elder. Thus the healer often faced the end of life with the knowledge that their efforts would fade, their remedies would be forgotten, and their name would be remembered only faintly, if at all. The healer also lived with the memory of failures. These were not dramatic or singular moments, but rather a long chain of patients who had not improved, children who had not survived, mothers who had not returned from childbirth, fevers that had burned too long, wounds that had festered despite every effort. Such memories lingered in silence, for to speak of them openly would have been dangerous, and yet they weighed heavily in private. At night, the healer might recall the faces of those they had tried to help and failed, the cries that had echoed in their homes, the funerals that had followed. These memories became part of the healer's quiet burden, carried to the end of life without relief.
Yet, alongside this heaviness, there was also a certain rhythm, a certain quiet acceptance, for the healer's life was woven into the life of the community in ways that could not be undone. They were present at births and at deaths, at moments of sickness and moments of recovery, at gatherings and at solitary visits. They were known to everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, and their presence was part of the fabric of daily life. Even if their remedies were uncertain, even if their cures were incomplete, the simple act of being there, of listening, of offering something, created a bond that few others could match. This, too, was part of their legacy, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. The passing of a healer was often quiet, marked by small rituals, attended by those they had served. Their tools, their jars, their bundles of herbs might be distributed. Their apprentice might attempt to continue the work. Or sometimes the knowledge simply faded away, leaving the community to seek another source of help, another figure to fill the space. Yet, for those who remembered, there lingered an awareness that the healer had carried a burden few others wished to bear, that they had endured suspicion, exhaustion, and endless demands, and that they had done so with patience, if not always with success. To reflect upon why it was so difficult, why it truly sucked to be a medieval healer, one must see the life not as a story of miracles or triumphs, but as a story of monotony, fatigue, and quiet endurance. There were no certain cures, no great victories over disease, no lasting recognition, and no guarantee of safety from suspicion or blame. Instead, there was only the repetition of the same small tasks, performed day after day, year after year, for a community that demanded everything but gave little in return. And yet, in that repetition, in that endurance, the healer became an essential part of the medieval world, a figure caught between hope and despair, between respect and mistrust, between life and death. And so the life of the medieval healer slowly faded, not with dramatic endings, but with the same calm monotony that had defined it from the beginning. A rhythm of tending, listening, preparing, and waiting, stretching out across the years until it was no longer possible to continue, and then passing quietly into memory, where the healer's burdens and efforts lingered, like dried herbs hanging in the rafters, faint in scent, fading with time, but still a reminder of what once was, of the endless patience and quiet endurance that marked the life of one who bore the heavy, thankless role of healer in the medieval world.